Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. As a business and healthcare law firm, we're often immersed in the heavy details of a particular issue or project. It's beneficial, if not mandatory, to every so often take a step back and evaluate the bigger picture. This season's theme is Zoom Out. We have all been immersed in the life of a global pandemic, and we're going to make sure with each story that we step back and look at how the issue we discussed will be impacted in our new normal.
You know, I'm excited for today's story. It's a classic. It's one you and I have been talking about for years, and I'm glad our audience is going to get to hear it today.
Yes. I mean, we've actually learned our own lessons from this story on how to guide our clients in employment contract situations. As you and I were prepping, I started thinking about our own interviews we've conducted over the years to hire people. We have some really funny stories.
Yeah, I definitely don't think we should go down the path of lessons learned about bad hire decisions.
Trail of Tears.
Yes. And I know that over the years we've had many moments where there were red flags and we completely ignored it, even when they was hitting us in the face. So let's just keep it much lighter. Michael, what is a funny interview memory of yours?
So one of my favorites, and you're going to remember this. This was at our old firm. I noticed on this young lawyer's resume that she listed spearfishing as a hobby.
Oh, man, this one got really spicy, yes.
And you know you are effective in your resume if you list something that's a hobby, and we can do a podcast on just that.
Yes.
Many years later. And so we had almost completed the interview with her, and the interview had gone great. And she actually was a leading candidate for the position.
Yeah, she had great grades, good internships. She was crushing the interview, basically.
And I think the one caveat at that point is just we really hadn't formed a connection with her yet. I mean, she was, understandably so, as an interview setting, pretty tense, and was giving us, her prepped answers. She's doing great, but I was just looking for something to lighten the conversation and see, just kind of who she was as a person, and just learn about her, kind of on a personal level.
Yeah, and for us, making that connection is pretty important. We try to protect our team from, we have a great team, and we always it's really important to us. So clearly, the spearfishing on her resume was a plant. Like it should have been, begging for us to ask some question about it.
And Brad, unfortunately, it worked. I asked the question.
You did.
And things took a turn. The mood shifted from job interview to that of a bad romance novel.
It did. It was like the voice changed, and I half expected some like bad soft music to start playing in the background.
Yeah. Her answer started with, one summer, in a remote area off the coast of France, she was taking summer courses and working, and then she went on to say that she met a local boy who was spearfishing out in the water.
Yeah, it was getting a little hot in there, and seriously, this went on into great detail for at least 10 minutes.
And we can't overstate the great detail part because it was getting really uncomfortable, and it was, it was a play-by-play about the local boy, about spending the summer together, and of course learning how to spearfish, which seemed very incidental to the overall story, and we were very uncomfy and did not ask any follow-up questions.
No, we did not. And I kept wondering at some point if she was going to break out to like Summer Lovin' from Greece, and maybe some backup singers were going to pop out, and maybe we were being punked or something. Or maybe like the local boy might maybe waiting in the lobby at the inn and they could reunite. But we kept sitting there staring as she kept telling the story, and we didn't want to make contact with each other. I thought we might burst out laughing because I didn't know what just happened, honestly.
Yeah, and Same. And we, felt like we were moments away from TMI. And I guess actually in retrospect, we were immersed in TMI the whole time
Yes.
because it was the most memorable part of the interview. And actually, she took herself out of the lead for that position.
Yeah.
What about you? What's your funniest interview story?
I know it's the funniest because the summer loving one, it was actually, if not the funniest, but still one was the awkward one. Because obviously it demonstrated if you put something on your resume, you can have a good story. Just don't go on and on and on and on. Just have some conciseness to it. But that leads me to another point. If you have something on your resume, please be able to explain it. And several years ago, you and I are interviewing, again, for someone for a law clerk position. On this person's resume, it noted that while they're in college, they were the chief executive officer of some limited liability company.
Oh, yeah. I remember this one. On paper, we were excited. We had a young entrepreneur in our office. And if I remember correctly, he went to my college. He went to UT.
That's correct. But like the last story, we asked what we thought would be a straightforward question, like, tell us about this company that you were the CEO and what did it do?
Yeah, he made the mistake of being brutally honest. He was not behind the confidence portrayed in the listing on the resume, and he just kind of came fully clean.
Yes, yeah. So this company that he was the CEO of was actually a limited liability company that owned a house that his dad bought. So while he was at UT, he could live there during college. And as his job, he basically made sure that he could live there and his friends paid rent. And he went on to tell us how his dad thought it would look good on his resume.
Yeah, so Daddy bought him a house, and he was named the CEO of the company that owned that.
And not that there was anything wrong with that, by the way.
No, I would agree, but I would also say that this is the interview version of form and substance that we talk about.
Yes.
Where if you're going to go out there and say, hey, I was the CEO of a company on your resume, you better have a good story to back it up.
I totally agree with that. I wish he would have done a better job of practicing what he learned as the acting CEO. Anything probably would have been better than my daddy made me do it.
Well, today's story, Brad, actually relates back to the interview process for a physician employment agreement. It's a classic story of unmet expectations that both our client and the employed physician carried into the employment relationship.
All right, let's get started, Michael.
So today our client in this story is a board-certified plastic surgeon. He's another famous surgeon that have made its way into one of our episodes.
Mm-hmm.
He's well known around the country. His practice would have and actually still would be viewed as a dream landing spot. We're going to call him Dr. Boomer.
I know the story, and I'm pretty sure Dr. Boomer did not go to University of Oklahoma for college, so let's guess he's a baby boomer.
Oh, yeah. The generational communication gaps in this story are so on point, so cliche, it's hilarious.
Yep.
It was not very funny when it happened.
Yes.
But when you look back, I mean, the stereotypes we associate with the different generations seem to be in full force with the expectations that each of them carried into this employment situation.
Anytime moment he was like, get off my lawn, I got to go watch Matlock. All right, so let's get back to the story.
Okay, Dr. Boomer was ready to hire a young plastic surgeon to eventually buy the practice from Dr. Boomer.
Yeah, and we should do a whole episode on this strategy. We've called this before the Sensei Plan. The idea here is that, that you, the senior physician, you're going to hire a physician, teach them how to be a great doctor, eventually teach them how to be a great partner, and then eventually transition that younger person to take over the practice.
Yeah, and so Dr. Boomer had a fellow working with him that year after she had been a senior resident.
Yeah, and fellowships are a common stage for doctors. It's that 1 year of hyper-focused practical training after their formal schooling has completed. And it's kind of like the apprenticeship after the last 6 years of post-college medical training.
So let's call this young physician Dr. Millennial.
Even I don't need to ask why. That's the nickname.
So Dr. Boomer and Dr. Millennial had a great experience working together during the fellowship year. They operated together on many cases and got along well personally, and were interested in a longer-term relationship.
Yeah, this is not an unusual scenario for a fellowship to turn into a long-term opportunity. Dr. Boomer called us a good 6 months prior to the fellowship ending. I remember this was a pretty straightforward contract.
Yeah, it actually for us doesn't get much easier. I mean, they knew each other, they worked together, and they had decided that they were going to, using our words, kind of kick the can down the road to figure out what the buy-in would look like. And, just to hit the pause button a second on that, when you're bringing someone in to employ them and they're going to buy in, sometimes you get a little bit into the weeds and try to figure out how to define what the ownership's going to look like. And that's some hard work and can be messy. And other times, like here, it's like, hey, you know what? Next step in the relationship is to be employed together, and then we'll move on to that next step. And so it really reduces the things that you have to figure out to, basically what are the terms of this stage of the relationship, the employment stage, and making sure everybody is on the same page.
Yeah, I think it's important to note for this story, Michael, for our audience, though, this Dr. Boomer had never hired a physician before. So, he was working through some of the compensation incentives, but, this is his first time really ever bringing on a physician employee.
Yeah, and, to be fair, there is something to figuring out the comp plan and making it match. And here, Dr. Millennial was being heavily recruited around the country, and she had a lot of opportunities. And so that helped kind of dictate the structure that Dr. Boomer was going to have to offer her. And so he went with a more kind of competitive, higher base salary with an incentive structure that kicked in after a certain level of collections were performed.
All right, so for the audience, they ended up joining together. Michael, what happened next?
What did not happen was good communication. I received the first phone call that there were some issues over a year after Dr. Millennial had joined. So picture us. In fact, at this point, you and I had worked together during the contract phase. I kind of finished it off, signed it. You and I didn't talk once about it. We probably didn't even think about it. And then all of a sudden, a year later, I get a call from Dr. Boomer, and, the symptom to the problem and the reason for the call was that Dr. Millennial was not very busy. In fact, she was not even operating enough to offset her large salary that had to be offered.
And so why was she so slow?
Well, this is where the generational communication gap came into play. So Dr. Boomer was triggered emotionally, and so when I started to ask the why question, it got anger emotion came out pretty quick, and started unloading about how lazy Dr. Millennial was being. She was not doing anything to generate business. He went on this diatribe about all the things he did when he got out of school to become busy, when he was a young and hungry surgeon.
Yeah, this is the whole, I walked a mile in snow uphill both ways speech. So, yeah, we've heard it.
Yes. Yeah. I got a snootful of it that day. And I'm sure she did as well, or some version of that. But I suggested to Dr. Boomer that maybe I could talk to Dr. Millennial to just learn a little bit more from her, because, I didn't want to just assume that she was lazy. Usually there's more to the story.
Sometimes there are.
Yeah. So I got on the phone with Dr. Millennial, and this time she was quickly triggered emotionally, which is kind of funny if you think about it. We represented the practice. And she was so triggered that she was ready to unload on me, the practice's attorney, just by asking a simple question of why she wasn't so busy. And she went on to say that, unloaded, that she had all these choices around the country to join all these prevalent practices. And she showed up to this practice every single day to work, and there was no patients there waiting for her to operate on. Her friends who worked reconstructive cases at the hospitals around the country could barely keep up with all the patients flooding in.
Yeah, we then try to get them on the same page and about trying to set the expectations for her and him. But Michael, what happened?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to overcome the Dr. Boomer's perception that she's an entitled millennial wanting to be spoon-fed, and Dr. Millennial's perception that she was walking into a busy practice and that Dr. Boomer had an overflow of work waiting for her. So it proved too little too late. Dr. Boomer ended up lowering Dr. Millennial's salary after a year or two to match her production, and she was gone 6 months later for another opportunity.
Yeah, no bueno. So let's take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, Michael, let's talk about the issues outside the contract to help minimize the likelihood of stories like this happening for our audience.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd. Now, Michael, this season theme is Zoom Out. And there's a lot to unpack with Dr. Boomer's story. As part of our Zoom Out theme, talk about the bigger picture of physician employment agreements. And really, I guess it's not just physician employment agreements, any type of employment agreement scenario.
It's really, full disclosure, it's not that hard to read what an employment agreement says. You don't have to be a lawyer to read what it says. Now, sometimes there's fancy words in there that people don't know what it means, and it's not that hard to help put together, at least for an attorney, the basic employment terms for a client when they're having.
It shouldn't be, Michael.
Yeah,
for an attorney.
If you step back, though, there's much more at play than the terms inside the contract, and that's actually true for all employment situations. There's more to it than what's being memorialized in writing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, typically when it comes to an employment contract or a physician employment contract or otherwise, the expectations as to how an employee would become busy is not typically written inside the agreement. Yes, both Dr. Boomer and Dr. Millennial had an unspoken expectation as to how Dr. Millennial would become busy, but it's not something you would put into a contract.
Unspoken expectations. This can be the death of any relationship.
Oh, yeah.
And this is precisely what happened here. Dr. Boomer and Dr. Millennial liked each other. They respected each other's quality of work and worked well together.
Yeah. And for an employed physician, the single biggest indicator of success is the business of the employed physician. This is one of those several areas that are not in the contract, but must be discussed.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if the doctor's not busy and they, like this case, have a huge, guaranteed salary, I mean, it's a ticking time bomb. It has a shelf life of how long that's going to work. And there's some other areas that are like that are not typically in the contract, but can cause major problems if they're not dealt with as kind of outside the contract type conversations, such as, what kind of support is going to be offered, particularly with surgeons. They have expectations of what their support's going to be so they can become busy. They have expectations about the types of cases they're going to get to work on, the call coverage that, they're finally out of training, and they may have expectations that they're not going to be covering call every night like they have for many years, yet the senior surgeon may be thinking, I'm finally going to unload my call coverage to the young doctor.
You use that word a lot today.
And it's not talked about. Yes, yes. And then finally, what's the path to partnership? A lot of times, that's not in the contract, and these can all be, major relationship roadblocks.
Totally agree, and that's probably the area where, it's the really thinking outside the contract. So before we get into the zoom out, I think for our audience who's been listening, Michael, so how did it end, at least in this story?
Unfortunately, this is one of those stories where everyone lost.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Millennial still to this day has not recovered, from the start to her career, and has basically, just struggled for years to gain traction with her practice. Dr. Boomer really became wary about hiring another doctor,
Mm-hmm.
and it's blocked him. And I think a lot of times kind of the emotions of what he went through has gotten in the way of him being able to use the strategy again and bring some other good opportunities into his practice. And I guess that would be fine if he made a conscious decision to kind of go a different route.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, he's been saying, I want to do it again. I want to go find this other doctor. And so he's just like, kind of carrying this weight, behind him of this bad past experience. And so he just keeps on having near misses on his attempts to bring someone into his practice.
Yeah, sounds like he has got a little bit of a commitment issue there, Michael. But Michael, again, let's hit the pause button and stick with our theme this year, and let's zoom out. As we come out of this pandemic, what do you see happening with employment agreements in our post-pandemic world? And your answer, and after that, I think obviously I have some thoughts too.
Yeah, I mean, you and I both had the same reaction during COVID when all the particularly the young physicians were going into their first jobs by doing Zoom interviews,
mm-hmm.
and how that was going to work. And I think anything that one of the things we've learned is that everyone from a human, perspective has adapted to Zoom because it's so efficient and we see so many uses of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the risk is, as they continue in this post-pandemic world, and I think they will, is that the risk for stories like this will only go up. You lose that human connection and the power of natural conversation to develop like it does when you're face-to-face.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just becomes more important to be self-aware of your expectations and to be able to communicate them.
Yeah, and during the interview process, I completely agree. The parties should consider all elements of a relationship. And this goes back to, when we asked those two questions on that resume that jumped out of us because we were trying to curious as to culturally, how will this person fit? And these are the things that really are outside of a given contract. It's not ever going to be inside a contract, which is, as we said earlier, how do you get busy, or how do you market yourself, or and this is, we're talking about plastic surgery practice, but for it, sometimes you're talking about what type of commercial payers are you having, and are they assigned to the doctors based on who's the first man in the door, the last man out the door. I mean, these are all very important elements that aren't always in. And then, of course, how does that physician interact with your team? You talked about staffing, but what if the staff only want to work with a senior doctor? These are all pieces that you really want to figure out. Probably, like anything else, are really important. High School Musical or Grease, all important questions to ask when you're setting expectations, and especially as the baby boomers start retiring, and the millennials are coming in to take over those practices. Those generational gaps, those discussions should be happening.
Yeah, for sure. And, I can't help but think that if we'd have done our Zoom interviews for our stories, how we started today, that, there might have been some soft, bad music that she could have played in the background when she started telling her story.
Probably so, Michael. Well, join us next Wednesday when we discuss with our special guests, how will medical boards answer the telemedicine call? Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.